First of all, the first presentation is on the European Union and the overseas countries and territories, a new relationship. And we'll call the overseas countries and territories the OCT, just as a useful acronym. The OCTs, just briefly to remind you, there are 27 OCTs in a special relationship to the European Union, which is currently governed by the Overseas Association Decision of 2001. Of those OCTs, we have 12 British: Anguilla, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Montserrat, Turks and Caicos Islands, St. Helena and the Dependencies, Falkland Islands, South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands, British Antarctic Territories, British Indian Ocean Territories, Pitcairn and Bermuda. Bermuda is not at present associated with the Overseas Association Decision of 2001. It chose always to distance itself, or rather not be engaged with Europe. It is now beginning to revise that, and indeed had a presence at the Secretariat and at the function in Brussels in January. So we may be having another British OCT on board. As far as the French are concerned, there are 6 French territories: French Polynesia, New Caledonian Dependencies, Wallis and Futuna Islands in the Pacific, Mayotte in the Indian Ocean, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon of Canada, French Southern and Antarctic Territories, and now a 7th new territory, which is Saint-Barthélemy, which joined the OCT on the 1st of January this year. There are also 6 Dutch territories, all in the Caribbean: Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao, Saba, St. Eustatius, St. Martin, and 1 Danish territory, Greenland. So these are our overseas countries and territories, and as you can see, they span the world. And that is of interest to the European Union, the fact that they are from north to south and from east to west. Let me begin by talking about the Overseas Association Decision of 2001 and the idea that substantial change was needed to that decision. The OAD, Overseas Association Decision, was largely modelled on programs which had been developed for the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, the independent countries, under the Lomé Conventions and the Cotonou Conventions. There was, from 1991, the beginning of a move away from that relationship, largely because it was felt that relationships which dealt with very large countries were not appropriate to the very small countries, which I've listed. The OCTs are mainly islands, and some of them are very, very small indeed. Pitcairn has a population of 46, so we are really at the very low level there. These distinctions from 1991 and then again in 2001 did move a little bit the OAD, the OCT, from the ACP, but not radically. And questions began being asked once the OCT formed their own association, the Overseas Countries and Territories Association, in 2001, and began meeting with the European Union on a regular basis. There began to be discussions about a new relationship. And ultimately, the European Union, in around 2006, thought that probably a very new relationship was needed. And it then decided to establish a process to find a new relationship. The deadline to find that was December the 31st, 2013. The Overseas Association Decision finishes then, and a new policy has to be in place by the 1st of January 2014. They began the process by issuing a green paper in 2008. And what you could well ask is, why begin a process in 2008, which after all wasn't going to happen for 5 years or so? simply because the last time round the process had been quite contentious and had been held up for some time. And so the European Union was allowing plenty of time for a new relationship. Moreover, the new relationship was going to be one not only that the European Union would negotiate with the member states, the 4 member states of France, the Netherlands, Denmark and UK, but also one in which the OCTs had a negotiating or at least a discussing role in the negotiation process. So therefore plenty of time was allowed for it. A green paper was released in 2008 by the European Commission. And this called for a new approach to distinguish EU OCT relations from relations with other countries. 3 main areas were identified as important to a new relationship. The character of the partnership, which were essentially covering political issues. What sort of partnership did we want? A close one? What sort of mechanisms were available? Trade arrangements, which were essentially technical issues, and trade covered those trade in goods and trade in services. And finally, special characteristics which were specific to the OCTs, development issues relating to their small size, and environmental issues. And the environment issues were new because they certainly had not appeared in the previous OAD of 2001. The environment wasn't that important on the international agenda at that time. With the Green Paper in place, the European Union established a consultation process and asked for responses over about a 4-month period to its Green Paper. There were responses by Anguilla, the BVI and the Cayman Islands from the Caribbean, also by Aruba and the Netherlands Antilles. But notice there were no responses by Montserrat or the Turks and Caicos Islands. And that actually was a feature of the consultation process. Not many people responded. Indeed, only 37 responses were received, 2 from private persons, one of which was myself. The rest being mainly governments and 2 sets of NGOs, one interested in the environment and the other NGO interested in transportation, mainly maritime transportation. So in other words, what we have here is a process in which very few people are engaged or are particularly interested outside the small, narrow group which are dealing with these issues. The countries of the Caribbean raised issues relating to aid, difficulty of accessing it, offshore finance, the importance of a level playing field, which you're aware of here, special arrangements which should apply to OCT countries as members of the European family, and finally differentiation amongst OCTs, recognising that Caribbean OCTs were different amongst themselves as well as from other OCTs like the Falkland Islands or French Polynesia. Having launched the consultation, the European Union responded by thinking about it for a year and then issuing a communication in 2009. This argued in favour of, quote, significant change to the association arrangements. Specifically, the European Union claimed that the consultation and its own work had pointed out that we needed 3 things: a reciprocal special partnership based on mutual interests, that there should be 3 main objectives to cooperation: increasing competitiveness as one, reducing vulnerability as another, and that vulnerability was identified as both economic vulnerability, the impact of, for example, financial crises on regions of small states, and also environmental vulnerability, the impact of hurricanes in the Caribbean. And finally, on promoting regional cooperation. And thirdly and finally altogether, it argued for a new approach to financing development. That is, it wanted more horizontal programs. And I'll come back to that issue later on. The communication issued in 2009 essentially built on the Green Paper. It didn't depart from it. The consultation process didn't bring any radical challenges to how the EU was formulating what it thought should be in a new future relationship. In December of 2009, the European Union Council, that is the body which makes the political decisions in the Foreign Affairs Council at the top of the decision chain in the European Union, endorsed the communication, that is essentially approved it, didn't ask for any changes to it, and called for, and I quote it here, a differentiated approach within a coherent framework in accordance with the constitutional provisions governing the relationship between the OCTs and the EU member states to which they are linked. I provide that quote simply to reinforce the point that the constitutional provisions are not of interest to the EU. The constitutional provisions between the four member states, Denmark, France, the UK and the Netherlands, are essentially matters between them and their OCTs. The EU does not have a view on this matter. The EU has, as we will see, a political interest, but it doesn't have a view on the actual nitty-gritty of the daily relationships. But it also spoke about a differentiated approach within a coherent framework. And what was being suggested here was that one single framework should be advanced in which various OCTs could relate to it in different ways. And that is the steer which has governed the way in which the European Union has taken forward its proposals since that time. The EU, having put forward its proposals in a communication, it was then up to the member states, the four member states, and the OCTs to respond to it. They had done this previously in 2003, largely on the initiative of the French. This time, the initiative was very much taken forward by the overseas countries and territories themselves. This was because beginning in 2001, the overseas countries and territories have formed their own association, the Overseas Countries and Territories Association, to which all OCTs belonged, and which met for one day prior to an annual OCT-EU forum, which met every year for 2 days. So 3 days of a year were being discussed to OCT-EU matters, one exclusive to the OCTs to formulate a position, and the other 2 days to dialogue with the European Union. The OCT also meets regularly with the European Union in Brussels. In the case of the UK ones, they are all based in London. Indeed, the only OCTs which have ever had a distinct presence in Brussels, that is in terms of a mission, have been Greenland, which still retains it, and French Polynesia, which has since closed its down. But the others maintain a London office or a Paris office or The Hague for the Dutch ones, and from that office they go down to Brussels, they meet as OCT countries, discuss with the European Union and with the member states on a regular basis, between 4 and 6 times a year, as well as sometimes in working parties. So the OCT have had an ongoing principle, and they were very keen to be part of the process this time. So the OCT led the process in developing a response to the Commission's proposals alongside the 4 member states of France, Britain, the United Kingdom, as France, Britain, Netherlands and Denmark. The joint position paper restated many of the issues of the EU OCT relations in the last 10 years and sought to maintain existing benefits and to enhance them where possible. If you look at the JPP, you can see that essentially what they did was go through all the discussions of the forums over those 10 years and tried to bring out the key points so that all points were covered. It proposes, first, assisting the sustainable development of the OCTs by improving competitiveness, reducing vulnerability and encouraging regional cooperation. So here is on the same framework as the EU originally set out. Secondly, confirming mutual benefits in which the OCTs are, quote, members of the EU family, unquote, and assets for the EU, quote, thereby requiring special and privileged relationship with the EU. And this notion of members of the EU family and assets for the EU are new language which has entered into the EU OCT dialogue in the last 5 or 6 years or so. So we're talking about new ways of considering it here. Secondly, it talked about confirming mutual benefits in which the OCT are members of the EU family. Sorry, I've done that, sorry. And thirdly, it talked about mechanisms designed to support the OCTs, which should take the special circumstances of the OCTs into account and include provisions by which the EU acknowledges this both within and outside the EU. And these special mechanisms designed to support the OCT were matters like a permanent and properly staffed OCTA OCTA Secretariat in Brussels with some technical capacity to it, and special circumstances of the OCTs were matters such as, for example, the European Union, when it entered into trade negotiations which could have impacts on the OCTs, informing the OCTs of these sorts of matters. The JPP ended with 7 key messages for the EU as essential elements in any relationship. I won't go through them, but those 7 messages essentially reconfirmed the importance of the OCTs as a special grouping for the EU. What was interesting was that the Cayman Island governments didn't sign this. Why they didn't sign it is an interesting point, which I would be interested to know about. I would be interested to know about it because, as far as I could see, there was nothing new in the JPP. The JPP was a restatement of what had happened in the previous 10 years of EU OCT relations. The experience since 2001 then suggests the emergence of a shared approach to a new Overseas Association decision among the main stakeholders, the OCT, the Commission and the 4 member states. The key themes are: 1, the new relationship should be different from the past. 2, it should recognise the values of the OCTs to the EU in a global and especially a regional context. And I will of course talk about the regional context of the Caribbean in my second presentation. And finally, it would involve mutual recognition, notice mutual recognition, of mutual responsibilities, which would see the OCTs as part of the European family. So we do have some emerging new issues involved in here, but we also have a fair degree of consensus over a broad range of issues as far as the Commission are concerned, the Member States are concerned, and the OCT themselves are concerned. Those themes haven't really changed a great deal. You can find them, certainly most of them, in the Green Paper, or signalled in a line or two in the Green Paper of 2008. However, the context has changed. When the Green Paper was being discussed and produced in the Commission, it was talking possibly about a new, fundamentally new relationship. It would have been easier in 2008 to have established such a new relationship before the financial crisis hit. Since then, of course, we've had the financial crisis. And as a result, it may be more difficult for a radically new relationship to be introduced. The financial circumstances, and is largely that, make this now much more difficult in an EU context. That said, I want to talk about three scenarios for a possible new relationship. The first one was a fundamentally new relationship. This, I think, was seriously the intent of the EU at the very beginning, or at least of the Commission in the EU, who, having to deal with it, wanted now to make some radical changes to bring the OAD up to date and make it clearly distinct from the sorts of programs which had been put forward for the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries. As I said, it is now doubtful because it would be difficult to introduce and circumstances have changed. And there's another dimension here. The stakeholders, that is both the 4 member states and the OCT themselves, haven't really argued for a radically new relationship. The joint position paper is a paper which restates issues over the last 10 years, doesn't call for radical departure from them. And the Commission itself hasn't carried out the various studies which would be needed were a radical new policy to be introduced. Second possible scenario is a relationship modelled on the outermost regions. The European Union also recognises another category of rather distant islands, which it calls outermost regions. These are countries which are integrated as part of the European Union. So in the Caribbean, we're talking about the Caribbean DOM, the Département Outre-mer, of Guadeloupe, of Guyane and of Martinique, and the new basically program relationships which you have in Saint Barthélemy and you have in Saint Martin, a new com status. The DOM-COM are part of Europe. So also, now that we have changes in the Dutch relationship, we are probably going to get Sabre, Saint Eustatius and Bonaire being parts of Europe. Further afield, Réunion in the Indian Ocean is part of Europe. And the Canary Islands, Madeira and the Azores are part of Europe. These are the outermost regions. And as outermost regions, but being part of Europe, they get substantial, massive transfers of aid, far in excess of anything that any developing country would receive from that. However, the aid doesn't come without strings. That aid, when it is given, requires these countries to move very close and finally accept European Union standards across every measure of activity, with 1 or 2 very minor derogations. However, the amount of aid did appear attractive, and the Netherlands Antilles in 2008 asked for 2 very large studies to be done about whether it might be possible to move, or in their interest to move, from an OCT status to an outermost region status. Those 2 studies were unambiguous. One was on the politics of it, and one was on the economics of it. And they said, yes, well, you could, but you'd be giving up a lot. Giving up your autonomy in political affairs, and in economic affairs, it didn't look as if it would be on your interest. Or as I found when I was in Curaçao maybe a year or so ago, talking to a number of officials about this measure, they said it was simple. If we had decided outermost region status at midnight, at 1 minute past midnight, we would close our refinery down. It wouldn't meet the environmental standards of the European Union. So they decided to stay with an OCT status. And interestingly, Saint Barthélemy has moved from an outermost region status to an OCT status to enjoy more political and fiscal autonomy. But equally, Mayotte in the Indian Ocean is moving from an OCT status to a DOM-COM status. So you can move within that. That option is available for Dutch territories, for French territories, for Denmark. It's not available to any UK OCT. The Treaty of Lisbon does not provide that provision for you. It provides that for the others. This OCT relationship with the outermost regions then is an interesting relationship because it does bear a lot and seems to be similar to the sorts of status of the OCT. But it is a very expensive relationship, and on the basis of that, it is a relationship which I think the European Union would treat with some caution. It's not available to you as UK overseas countries and territories. And it may well be that some of the EU member states like Spain or Portugal would object to countries moving to such a status en masse as against one or two at a time. So I judge that that relationship will not be one which will be offered to you, although I think bits of that relationship might be taken out and reformulated. These are the horizontal programs and be available to you. The third scenario is an incremental approach building on the 2001 Overseas Association decision. This is the most likely approach and outcome. It's the way the European Union usually proceeds, or the European Commission, I should say, usually proceeds, especially when it sees that there aren't any major or difficult problems. And I think that by starting that process earlier, as I suggested, it was hoping to anticipate and iron out any of the difficult problems which were occurring on the way. It's also been endorsed by the OCT and the 4 member states in the joint position paper. The position JPP basically sets out a program which sees a modernisation, updating and increasing benefits OAD rather than a new, fundamentally new OAD, as I've said. And it's also an approach which will find least resistance in the Council, which has to unanimously approve any new Overseas Association decision. And I say that simply because it's been known for some years that within the European Union, some of the Eastern European new member states do not think that this decision is in their interests, or they think it's expensive, or they don't see why they should be associated with it, as against the original founder members of the European Union. And since it has to be unanimous, technically it could be vetoed by one. So therefore there has to be some politics behind this in order to ensure that it comes forward. The decision on that will be taken on a new Overseas Association decision, will be taken in July of this year. Why I also think that it will be based on the existing OAD is the sorts of work which is emerging from various working groups established by the European Commission to examine various aspects of that relationship. For example, 2 recent concept notes from those working groups, the one on trade and trade-related aspects and the one on environment and climate change, more or less used those particular frameworks in putting forward their proposals. Finally, the speech by Commissioner Piebalgs to the 10th Forum in Brussels in January this year more or less set out and signalled that that would be the case. Key features were, and I've put in the paper in inverted commas some of his quotes: partnership as a two-way street, a special relationship in the European family, a platform for the promotion of European values in the world. The notion of values is again a new element in any relationship, but if you go back to the Lisbon Treaty, which is the treaty governing European Union integration, values were brought into that in the foreign policy section for the first time, so that's consistent with that. Talks about the next 10 years, so it's not talking about a relationship which arguably you could have argued should have gone on for 20 years or 30 years. After all, when the Lomé Conventions were finished, Cotonou went for 20 years. But it's talking about a 10-year decision. Other points were simplification of procedures, something which is drastically needed, but he also made a side comment that perhaps not much could be done here. Well, we'll see. Green and renewable energies, preservation of biodiversity, and giving a larger slice of the EDF cake to regional actions. He also talked about a sum of money, 343.4 million, to the next European Development Fund, exclusive to the overseas countries and territories, national and regional programmes. And he talked about continued access and support for horizontal funds. Horizontal funds are available to all the OCTs. They are not available to any other country which is not considered part of Europe, because they are European funds. They are funds which are available to the OCTs because the OCTs are European, are British, French or Dutch or Danish citizens. And as such, they have entitlements to certain funds which promote issues. For example, one particular fund which, having been mentioned of some of the issues in the conference last week, were about improving technical and vocational and educational skills and improving human capital. There's a large fund for that as a horizontal programme in the EU. And while the Cayman Islands has a per capita income above that of the European Union average per capita income, and therefore cannot get national funds, can get regional funds, cannot get national funds out of the European Development Fund, it can access horizontal funds without any limitation. And so these are the sorts of funds which you should be looking at in the future. Are these sorts of proposals acceptable to the OCT? If not, can they do anything about it? It will be difficult now, I think, for the OCT to do very much. They've not had a technical secretariat in Brussels in the last few years to help put all this together and to provide a steer for some of the OCTs back at home. There's also lack political clout. Remember my comment about only 37 responses to the consultation document. There's not much interest in the OCT in the European Parliament. Only 3 members of European Parliament are really interested, and out of that only 1 is super interested, and that's Maurice Ponga, who represents New Caledonia, or French party in New Caledonia. So it's difficult to get the MEPs on board on this issue. NGOs are not particularly interested outside of an environmental lobby. Also, you don't have much time. The decision is essentially more or less made now and will be conveyed to the Commission in July of this year. So the real platform to now intervene in the process is through your relationships with various national bodies, and in the position that you are in, that means through the UK government. Finally, I did promise a slide on how this might affect the Cayman Islands government. I decided to do this having come to the conference last week, and I thought that listening to a few things at the conference might give me an idea of what the issues might be that you could tackle. And I think the biggest issue which came out of that conference was the need for diversification. That is to move some of your resources away from financial services, tourism, important as they are, and look at new areas. And certainly themes of diversification and the sustainable development of the EU would be very much part of an EU presentation on this sort of matter. There's some specific issues, competition in services, for example. The present OAD has in Article 45(2)(b) a particular issue which, were you to seek closer association with any of the Caribbean regional bodies and allow them access to your services area, you would also equally have to allow the European Union access to your services area. Now, you know, that is not very developmental friendly for small countries, and it could be changed and probably will change. a tourism annex. Maybe the opportunity for that has been now lost, but given the importance of tourism not only to all the Caribbean OCTs, but also to some of those overseas in the Pacific, then that is, I think, a key issue. And not only in nice warm territories, but the Falkland Islands, for example, is very much going down the tourism route. And earlier this year I was in Greenland, and that's going down the tourism route. So there is a commonality amongst the OCTs, which should perhaps be more strongly promoted. Stakeholder dialogue. I think a weakness in the OCT relationships, and it's not something which is simply to the Cayman Islands, although I suspect it here, but when I travelled round to other Caribbean islands, Aruba, Curacao, British Virgin Islands, Anguilla, talking about these issues, it was very clear to me that outside of Curacao, which has had a much longer relationship and a much more intimate relationship with the European Union, not a lot of people knew very much in the private sector or in the NGOs about OCT-EU relations. Indeed, key people in chambers of commerce hardly knew anything about it at all. And so there has to be some way in which a private sector dialogue and an NGO stakeholder dialogue, particularly on environmental issues, could be brought into that process. And here you might want to amend Article 5.3, which talks about a dialogue with the private sectors and NGOs, but only if the European Union and the member state and the OCT all agree that these are the people who they should be dialoguing with. I would have thought that it's up to you as an OCT to say who you put forward as part of a dialogue mechanisms. I think you should also talk about the EU alerting you on preference erosion. There is undoubtedly some preference erosion in EU-OCT relations. Now, you don't do a great deal of trade in terms of external trade to the OCT in terms of goods, and it's that which has been the principal area of erosion. But of course there can be and there will be erosion in services, which have been a key feature of the partnership agreements. I'll talk about that in the Caribbean context. And of course there's the vexed issue of the level playing field on financial services, which of course you've met before in your relationships with the OCT. And the level playing field has been strongly pointed out and emphasised not only by Cayman Islands but also by BVI. And finally, support access to and knowledge of EU horizontal programmes. If you look at the record, hardly anyone has been able to get any money out of these horizontal programmes, even like in a place like Curacao, which has had a long familiarity with dealing with the EU. The EU has promised, and Commissioner Peelbag suggested, and there's certain hints have been dropped, that there will be newer and easier mechanisms to access those programmes in the future. And that is something where I think the Cayman Islands certainly needs to keep its eye on, as I said before. So in concluding my comment, there will be a new relationship, but it's probably not a new relationship, but I might want to retitle it a renewed relationship. But in that renewed relationship, there will be new elements. And that is clearly the case. So thank you for listening. Well, thank you very much. I hope I don't have to rush things too much. Essentially, what I want to talk to you today about is the European Union's engagement with the Caribbean, and particularly with the regional dimension of that engagement. And I'm not trying to sum here or talk about the European Union's arrangements with any individual Caribbean territory, whether it be Jamaica or Haiti or the Cayman Islands or whatever. I'm talking about the regional dimension, which is where I think the Cayman Islands would actually sit within any framework of proper Caribbean regional association. And I also want to do this because the European Union, in its proposals, has said that it wants to push up the agenda and to make stronger recommendations on the regional side of its programmes. So it's that which is my cue. First of all, the European Union and the Caribbean. The European Union and the Caribbean has had associations with the region since the first Lomé Conventions in 1976. Well, technically it had associations with the Dutch and French territories before that, but the real association has come with the first Lomé Convention of 1976. The focus was initially on aid and trade with the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, the now independent countries, Jamaica, Trinidad and so on, going down the line, and the OCT. And the OCT, as I mentioned earlier, were treated in a similar way to the ACP. However, and what is important to notice is that over the years, the European Union-Caribbean relationship has widened from simply a trade and aid relationship to a relationship which has also talked about political dialogue and political partnership. So in other words, broader issues have been introduced into the EU-Caribbean relationship, particularly from about 1986, 1990 onwards. And that political dialogue has been a key element, which we'll meet again later on. Secondly, the European Union's engagement with the Caribbean was originally with its British OCTs, British ex-OCTs in terms of colonies, Dutch and French. But increasingly in recent years, the European Union has been engaged in dialogue with Haiti, where it's got a significant interest, with the Dominican Republic, where I think it's got an even bigger interest, and in Cuba, where it potentially had the largest interest, but in which matters have been put on hold, largely because of the questions of political issues and the nature of political arrangements in Cuba. So in other words, the Caribbean has come wider than it was in 1976 with the first Lomé Conventions to involve all the Caribbean countries, and has also become a broader engagement, moving from aid, trade, until politics. So that's what we need to bear in mind going over the years. That said, the European Union now has no less than 3 separate frameworks in which they engage with the Caribbean region. The first framework in which they engage is within CARIFORUM and the Caribbean Economic Partnership Agreement. CARIFORUM is the mechanism which they've set up to have a dialogue with the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries in their widest sense. So that includes not only the ex-UK territories, but also the Dominican Republic and Haiti. CARIFORUM is located in the CARICOM Secretariat in Guyana, and another job of CARIFORUM is to facilitate and move forward the Caribbean Regional Indicative Programme. And the Caribbean Regional Indicative Programme, the current one of the 10th EDF, talks about closer engagement with the Caribbean Overseas Territories, the OCT, with the French DOMCOM, and with the Caribbean ACP. A very modest sum of 6.6 million euros were allocated to trying to get closer regional cooperation between these bodies. And I want to make a point at the beginning that the European Union also makes a distinction between regional cooperation, which it sees basically as a policy involving all Caribbean territories, and regional integration, which is a much deeper process involving the CARICOM units and the Organisation of Eastern Caribbean States. And this is something to which I'll come back to again at the end. Within the regional programme, they talked about regional task forces. Regional task forces were indeed set up involving the OCT, the DOM, Com and the Caribbean ACT. They were set up on HIV/AIDS, on disaster management, on interconnectivity, and on trade and investment. But none of them have really worked. The only one which has basically continued and been given any traction is the one on trade, and which is an investment which runs out of the Barbados Export Division. The others have all disappeared. And one of them, on disaster management, had only one meeting, of which the preparatory meeting the OCTs were at, but at the main meeting they were not. So not much interest in this area so far of broad cooperation in the region, and not much interest in the OCT in it. The second area I want to talk about is the Caribbean Economic Partnership Agreement. The Caribbean Economic Partnership Agreement was agreed in October 2008. Negotiation began with it in 2004. And all of you know that the Economic Partnership Agreement essentially seeks to establish a relationship which will involve reciprocity, eventual reciprocity, in trade, in all areas, goods, services and the like, between the European Union and the Caribbean ACP countries. The negotiations began in 2004, but only in 2006 did the Caribbean OCT appear on the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery radar. And remember, the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery was a body which was set up to negotiate the EPA on behalf of the Caribbean. That did a study, and it ruled out the Caribbean overseas countries and territories as original EPA members. They, in their concept paper, they put forward to the Council on Trade and Development in the CARICOM, said that the OCT should not at this stage necessarily become part of the process, although they left the door open for future involvement. And the EPA does contain a clause which allows you to join it if you so wished. However, an ECLAC study advised against the Caribbean OCTs joining it. That's a study by the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and suggested that it would be much better for the Caribbean OCTs to negotiate their own arrangement with the EU if they wanted a collective Caribbean arrangement than to join the EPA. A similar conclusion was also reached in an OCT-EU study on regional integration, which was released in 2010, and that advised against EPA membership for the Caribbean OCT. It said that a specific Caribbean OCT-EU agreement would be best. The question we have to ask, and we might ask this again, is this impossible? Are the Caribbean OCT ready to negotiate it? Do they have the technical capacity? Are they ready to negotiate it collectively, or simply a couple of them? And if it's only a couple of them, are the EU willing to negotiate one which only involved a few countries? And how do you do it? What is the arrangement and mechanism through which this should be done? It also stated, the study, that you should have closer regional cooperation, but didn't state how that closer regional cooperation should come about. A second framework is a framework involving the French territories, the Département Outre-mer and the Communauté Outre-mer. There's been two sets of experiences in which the French DOM-COM have sought to become closer and involved in regional cooperation projects with the Caribbean ACP and the Caribbean OCT. One is via the Organisation for Eastern Caribbean States, the 6 countries, small countries of the Eastern Caribbean, excluding Barbados, but including as associate members Anguilla, and British Virgin Islands, and including as a full member Montserrat. The OEC has had an experience for over 20 years on programs which it sought to advance with the various regional councils of the DOM-COM. And it's the regional councils which are empowered with dealing with economic development under the French DOM-COM arrangements, and it's the regional councils which have tried to engage with various programs with the OECS. If you look at those programs, you will find that there have been very few, that while there have been a couple of real results, those real results have not been rolled forward, and so forth. The programs are not sustainable in any particular way. There's a wish for engagement, but not really a long-standing practice of engagement building on firm foundations. A second experience is the Interreg experience. The Interreg experience comes from the fact that Martinique and Guadeloupe and Guyane, although it's Martinique and Guadeloupe you would be interested in, can, as DOM and the other COM, access the European Development Funds. They get massive, mega millions from the European Development Funds. And part of that European Development Fund they get is called Interreg, and it's for developing cooperation between the DOM and the rest of the Caribbean. That is the ACP and the OCT. The current Interreg 4 allocates 67 million euros for cooperation in 2007-2013. It's extremely wide eligibility. The countries involved are not only all the countries from the Caribbean Sea, including Cuba down to Trinidad, but all the ones on the mainland, including Central America, including bits of Caribbean Mexico, including Caribbean coastlines of Venezuela, Colombia, and going right down to northeast Brazil. So a lot of countries involved in the programs. Even so, hardly anyone bothers with them. Why don't they bother with them? Because the principal beneficiaries have to be the DOM-COM. The money is all paid out in euros. They're difficult to access funds, and every Interreg returns about 3/4 of the funds allocated to it at the end of that time. But it is there, and there is some interest on this, and particularly the overseas, the chambers of commerce in Guadeloupe and Martinique have accessed Interreg money to try and dialogue with other chambers of commerce in the region. Barbados and Trinidad come to mind in particular. So there could be opportunities for accessing that funds to engage in wider regional trade. But outside of that, the Caribbean ACP are not that involved. What is the Caribbean OCT interest? Well, yes, BVI and Anguilla are there, but in talking to people in Anguilla and in French Saint Martin, even though there is a willingness to cooperate, and in Dutch Saint Martin, not much is done there either. So the Interreg programs are pretty weak. The third framework is with the Caribbean OCT. And this is something which was hinted at in certain of the studies. The framework here would be one which recognises that while in the past there have been a couple of negative issues in the relationship between the Caribbean OCT and the European Union, they've not actually been massive issues which have prevented cooperation. They've been resolved. One issue you know about, which was the Savings Directive. The other issue was many years ago on what was called accumulation for sugar and rice, and it led to issues in the 1990s between particularly the Dutch, the Netherlands, Antilles and Aruba and the European Union, which eventually involved the European Union invoking safeguard measures over the importation of sugar and rice into the European Union market. But they have been overcome, so there's not a lot of negative issues there. And given there's not a lot of negative issues, can you get some positive issues by which you would get some sort of funding? The overseas countries and territories of the Caribbean are allocated EDF funds, and the EDF 9th and 10th do give national programmes. There's no national allocations for the BVI and the Cayman Islands, but as we know, you have had programmes from which you've benefited in the past. I've mentioned the Environment Programme. Another one was the ASCUDA Programme, which is a general regional programme about involving radar coverage in the region and so on. So there are issues and regional areas where you can deal with that. There's also a regional programme. The current Caribbean regional programme is 15 million euros. It's recently, I understand, been approved. It's before the Dutch and the OCT, and there's one single project in it, which is improving small and medium-sized enterprises. So it's a business development programme. The regional authorising officer for that programme for the OCTs, the UK ones, is the Virgin Islands, and there is a person in place there by which that can be accessed, and there's a regional authorising officer in the Netherlands, in Curacao, for that programme. It's new, the money will be there, or is there, and so therefore it can be accessed. And for example, I was talking to someone yesterday who was interested in this at my presentation, and I was also talking to the college on Friday to someone who runs a business section there who's interested in that sort of money. So the Cayman Islands could possibly access that cash. Beyond that regional one, there is of course problems with accessing money. We've touched on those. I won't go through them again. It's not easy, it's overly bureaucratic, but hopefully new procedures and dedicated instruments will emerge by which this can be done. So we have three frameworks for the region. We have a Caribbean OCT one, I've just discussed. We have a framework with the DOMS, which the European Union is funding, and we have a framework with the independent Caribbean. None of them are convergent. They're all parallel. I've yet to meet anyone in the European Commission who has sat down and put all three lots together and thought about a common programme. And so there is an issue there which needs to be tackled. And this, of course, is an issue which the European Union also has some views on. At the moment, the European Union is very interested in developing what it calls a single coherent framework for all the developing Americas. It's a strategy of linking the Caribbean with Latin America. It began about 10 to 12 years ago, and in which the Caribbean and Latin America were increasingly linked together at the highest level in the European Union. We're talking about the highest levels of European Union commissioners and at the highest level of ministers of various European Union member states. Its particular formula was the EU, Latin American and Caribbean summits, and we do a 7th EU, Caribbean, Latin American summit. It was to be held in Santiago in June. It's now postponed and will be held in Santiago in January of next year. Of interest in that is that the Chilean president will be travelling up to the CARICOM meeting in July of this year in preparation, presumably, for hosting that particular summit. And as you are observer members of CARICOM, it might be very useful to go down and see and to hear what the Chilean president might have to say, or at least influence him, because otherwise the OCT may well be left out of this particular arrangement. So that's something possibly to plan. More recently, the EU has talked about moving the Latin American and Caribbean relationship into what it calls a joint Caribbean-EU partnership strategy. So it's beginning to link the EU with that, with the individual Caribbean independent countries and with the Latin American countries. But it's not done much, and a big program, a seminar conducted on this in Trinidad last year found that very little had actually happened on it. So it's there, it's at the highest political levels, it's at the level of aspiration rather than realisation, but it's something which you need to monitor. A second scenario is a single coherent framework for all EU-Caribbean relationships. The question we must ask is the European Union interested in this, given scenario one, given the wider EU-Latin American dialogue, political dialogue that they want, and given that Latin America and Mercosur and other free trade arrangements with the larger Latin American countries are very much in the European Union's sights. Indeed, are the independent Caribbean countries interested very much in a special relationship, a single coherent framework for all the EU countries? We know how difficult Caribbean integration is to move forward. We know that CARIFORUM is not a dynamic body in terms of moving the EPA, the Economic Partnership Association, forward. Its role is implementing that, and yet implementation has been very weak. Moreover, there are new suitors on the horizon. There's Brazil not far away. There's China, which has already been involved, as we know, in the region, and India potentially, given the Indian populations of Guyana and Trinidad, and beyond that to other countries of the region. So in other words, the BRICS, with the exception of Russia, may be more interesting partners for this. And so we have to think about that. And finally, Venezuela. Some of the countries are partners with ALBA, and ALBA has proved divisive in the region in the past. So in other words, there are other partners for these independent countries other than the EU. So moving on, what about a single coherent framework for the OCT with regional variation? The thrust of the Overseas Association decision and the proposals for the new decision has been greater regional cooperation. Sometimes the word regional integration makes a mention, but it's usually regional cooperation, which is the theme. It promises more of the same, as I've said, but equally what is in the Overseas Association decision is some promotion of closer regional cooperation in the region. Is there an opportunity, a possibility, for the Caribbean OCT to get together to do this? The experience up to now has not been very positive. I cite two examples. When the European Union OCT Forum was held in the Cayman Islands in 2008, the discussion at the end of it, a document was released saying that you wanted to move, or the Cayman Islands and the other OCT in the Caribbean wanted to move forward to closer association with the DOMS and with the Caribbean ACP. That did happen. It was the working groups that I pointed out in number one, the various groups on HIV/AIDS, on regional disaster management, on interconnectivity, on trade issues. They've not been an astounding success. So therefore, that needs to be measured and looked at. Secondly, more recently, a memorandum of understanding has been prepared in London to try to bring together the Caribbean OCT in terms of the regional programs, for which, remember, the Dutch and you have access. But it's a memorandum of understanding largely about accessing EDF funding. It doesn't really go very much wider than that. Isn't there the prospects and possibilities of going wider than that? If you do, you're going to have to engage in discussions with the Dutch OCTs as well as with the UK OCTs. And while the Dutch OCTs do see some merit in it, I think they may be difficult to move forward. And when I spoke to Dutch OCTs, Aruba and Curacao, down there off Venezuela, they said that the ACP weren't interested in them in the Caribbean, and they saw very little reason why, therefore, the OCT would be interested in them. So it's a difficult task, but I just raise it as an issue, because the other two frameworks are ones which you're excluded from, or you're not going to get much benefit from. So maybe this framework is a better one for you to explore. Finally, what about the impact and interests of the Caribbean, of the Cayman Islands governments? Regional integration, can the EU help? That's the issue which I think we have to address here. I've already discussed the possibility of you looking to the EU to talk about a special arrangement between the Caribbean OCT and the EU. Would the EU fund some technical studies for such an arrangement, for example? Could be one way. But of course you would need collectively to get together, and would that be part of the access from regional funding, or could you get it through some of the horizontal funding? I don't know. You're going to have to discuss with others how best to do that. Secondly, the European Union has talked about the economic partnership agreements, and of course has trumpeted the Caribbean Economic Partnership Agreement. It negotiated that first. It's through the difficult process of trying to do others in Africa and the Pacific and finding lots of problems and issues. The Economic Partnership Agreement was very divisive in the Caribbean itself for those who follow those issues. But what you should ask the EU to do is, given the EU says it has special responsibilities for the OCT, but has negotiated an economic partnership agreement with the Caribbean countries, then you should ask the European Union about what areas it is discussing with them which may erode your preference or increase competition from those countries with you. That is something which you can ask, I think, quite rightly, for them to take back to you. Centres of excellence. In their various proposals for the overseas associated decision, they've made a lot about centres of excellence. They want regional centres to be established in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean and in the Caribbean, in which you, or one country, would be able to be the key country in a particular area. Is there anything in which you could be a centre of excellence? I suggested yesterday marine environment could be an area where you might want to try to promote some sort of centre of excellence. The BVI could also be looking at various areas to do that. TCI when it comes back on board as well. In terms of CARICOM, virtually every study that has been done has said that it's not the OCT's interest to join CARICOM, but it is the OCT's interest to promote functional cooperation and to go wider than that and share common services, such as, for example, in meteorology and matters like this. And I suggest that the OECS is also an area where such cooperation can also be sought, if not for the TCI, then certainly for the BVI and Anguilla and Montserrat, given their particular involvement in those areas. And finally, I come back to the last point. I think you should seriously think about exploring a separate Caribbean overseas countries and territories regional arrangement with the EU. But of course, you have to specify the mechanism to do it, and at least one Caribbean OCT country has to decide that this is something it wants to do and is worth doing and sets the ball rolling. So thank you again.